The 17th century was witness to a rather shocking historical intellectual paradox. On the one hand, the early modern witch trials were reaching their terrifying crescendo, and on the other, philosophical modernity was emerging with Cartesian rationalism and Baconian empiricism. It's very possible that the very same people that first read Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, from the pen of René Descartes, could also smell the acrid aroma of a nearby incinerated body, or the metronomic swaying of those dangling from the gibbets convicted of criminal witchcraft. Thus, for a very few brief years, the witch and the rationalist were both a hunted species. But what did these early modern philosophers make of the question of witches and witchcraft, of demonology? Unsurprisingly, given the witch craze around them, virtually all philosophers of this period did in fact weigh in on just that question. So let's explore how the philosophers that gave us intellectual and scientific modernity understood witchcraft, demonology, and the massed execution of alleged witches unfolding all around them. Make sure to subscribe here for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this channel, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, where you could support us there, or some of the cool merch we have available. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get a reliable lay of the land for this kind of information, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in historical books, actual historical relics on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out our bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books, with a freshly updated catalog. You can begin to find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the relationship of philosophical modernity and witchcraft. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Before turning to the philosophers, let's be clear about what we mean by the so-called witches in question for this episode. The witch that was the target of the early modern witch trials was a very specific legal theological entity that took centuries to develop by demonologists. Now, while magic had long been a sin by biblical law, it was only in the late 14th and 15th centuries that it increasingly was transformed into a heresy. Not just a sin, a heresy, by inquisitors like Nicholas Emmerich and Johannes Nider, before being fully elaborated, most infamously in texts such as The Hammer of Witches or the Malleus Maleficarum, published by that very demented inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, or Institor, in 1486. Now, I have done a ton of content, hours worth of content, on the development of what scholars now call the elaborated theory of witchcraft, with full episodes on all those figures that I just mentioned, along with the books that they wrote. So you may want to check out some of those if you just want to get a better understanding of the way in which people understood witches at this time. But by the late 15th century, the elaborated theory of witchcraft, as scholars typically understand it, had emerged. We now understand this as a kind of European-wide and really worldwide conspiracy theory developed in the minds of inquisitors, jurists, theologians, and philosophers of the late medieval and early modern period that held, here we go, a new woman-led heretical sorcery sect had appeared in Europe, marked by entering into a pact or covenant with the devil and thus officially apostasy from Christianity. This would typically involve sexual relations with the devil and demons, along with incest, aerial flight for the purposes of attending an assembly known as a sabbat or a synagogue, which was presided over by Satan himself, in which initiates entered into said pact or covenant, usually by signing their name in a book with blood, followed again by incestuous and promiscuous sex, the general practice of maleficent magic, the slaughter of fetuses and babies, sometimes to make things like flying potions, and various other means for preventing human beings from procreating, like making dudes' penises disappear, whose aim was to undermine all of Christendom as a part of the devil's ongoing war with God. In fact, by the mid-15th century, this whole theory, as much as it was one, took on positively apocalyptic dimensions by arguing that the new witch heresy was the very final attempt on the part of Satan to forestall his impending doom by sending all of human beings on a kind of spiral in sin and crime as a final outrage against God. Now, to be very clear about this, there is virtually no evidence that these witches, as described by this theological, juridical conspiracy theory, ever existed at all, thus making the nightmare of these trials all the more horrible. Ultimately, the trials were Christians killing other Christians, and among the most vulnerable Christians in society. The single greatest predictor for being executed as a witch in this period was simply being a poor, unmarried, elderly woman, often suffering from dementia or some other mental illness. And this point did not go unnoticed, by the way, by at least some of the people at that time, and skepticism about the existence of these witches and their heresy cult and the validity of confessions are often arrived at through manipulation and straight up torture, along with the mass execution for these crimes, was also met with published skepticism by at least some philosophers, jurists, theologians, and even some inquisitors. Even some inquisitors looked at all this and said, this is insane. And we're going to look at the range of reasons why many philosophers, and again, priests and inquisitors, thought something very wrong was going on. Interestingly enough, some of the earliest sustained criticism of the witch trials comes from the world of the occult philosophy itself. And while it's been greatly overstated, Cornelius Agrippa, the author of the famed 3 books of occult philosophy, did seem to have a complex relationship to the question of witches and witchcraft. On the one hand, he clearly held throughout his career that witches did in fact exist, they did make pacts with the devil and with demons, and they should be rightly punished for it. There's just no real denying that if you read what Agrippa says. And this is a consistently held position throughout his entire career as we have it. However, Agrippa is also equally famous for his defense of an accused witch at Metz in 1519, where he acted as legal advisor to the local magistrate there. In this case, the woman in question, we don't know her name like most of the women who were murdered, was imprisoned, tortured, and deprived of even food and water on the flimsiest of evidence imaginable, even exculpatory evidence and forged evidence. Agrippa himself argued to the local judge that the inquisitor, Nicolas Savin, was driven himself by personal animosity, cruelty, and was moreover corrupt, bribing criminals to testify against this poor woman. Further, the inquisitor relied on the worst arguments of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a text that was always under some degree of theological and legal scrutiny, and it was even eventually banned for use by the Catholic Church in 1600. This had basically violated her legal procedural rights, and further even committed heresy. The inquisitor was committing heresy by arguing that the woman in question was a witch, because, at least in part, her mother had been executed as a witch. Agrippa countered on both procedural and theological grounds, especially arguing that the sins of that sort aren't inherited from her mother. Her being baptized as a child would have exercised any demonic power over her. And while we have Agrippa's brief to the judge, we don't know what the exact outcome of this trial was. Within a year of Agrippa having left that post, we do know that that inquisitor, Savin, was back at witch hunting, and we don't know the fate of the poor woman that Agrippa defended. Although some texts do say that she was acquitted, I think the jury's out about what really happened. But Agrippa's interjection in this case is interesting, given that we have a philosopher deeply associated with occultism, hermeticism, and Kabbalah offering a relatively spirited defense of an accused witch, despite the fact that legally, defensor non admittor, a defense isn't permitted for such a witch in these witch trials. In fact, if you defended a witch and she was convicted, you got the same punishment she did. And even more so, that beyond simple defending her legal and procedural rights, he also injects a theological rebuttal of the inquisitorial demonologists precisely against the reasoning, as much as it is reasoning at all, of the Malleus Maleficarum, having a convicted witch as a mother, even when convicting of having fornicated with the devil himself, does not a witch daughter make. It's even said that Agrippa composed a tract entitled Adversus Lamiarum Inquisitore, against the inquisition of the witches, but if it did actually exist and it were written by Agrippa, only basically a couple of quotations from it survive, and ironically enough, in the works of another inquisitor who had converted from Judaism of all things. But as I mentioned, Agrippa's skepticism of the witch trials and of the existence of witchcraft has been greatly overstated. But his student, Johann Weyer, is rather exemplary in just that regard. In his De Praestigiis Daemonum, or On the Trickery of Demons, first published in 1563 but greatly expanded and reworked through his lifetime, he expressed theological and philosophical, but also medical doubt, medical critiques to the concept of witchcraft and its persecution. Weyer actually himself was a medical doctor, and he held to the relatively classic view of St. Augustine that demons, up to and including the devil, are only really capable of causing illusions and delusions. They can't actually manipulate the world without God intervening and letting them do that, and then they only have the power to invite such deception so long as people seek them out to be deceived. Weyer then points out the hypocrisy of the Inquisition and the witch hunts. Numerous books of demonic magic appear in print, with many learned men no doubt inviting such demonic interactions, and yet the victims of the witch hunts are overwhelmingly uneducated women. In fact, one of the books he's imagined is probably the so-called fourth book of occult philosophy, attributed to his teacher Agrippa. But he's examined some of these women in his medical practice, these women accused of witchcraft, and he's found that they all share a common quality. They're all suffering from what he calls melancholia. Now, he does in fact engage in the typical misogyny of the day by arguing that the weak physical and moral constitutions of women, such that they fall victim especially easily to this condition of melancholia. However, this just isn't the classical imbalance of the humorous version of melancholia, but for Weyer, a complex condition marked by an increased likelihood of delusions, confusing dreams with reality, fits of anger, memory loss, and even false memory, and generally what we might now call something like psychosis mixed with schizoaffective-like symptoms, such as command voices. These sections of De Praestigiis Daemonum detailing his analysis of melancholia are just so extraordinary that Weyer has been hailed as the father of psychiatry. In fact, on the merit of some of these sections, Sigmund Freud went on to say that De Praestigiis Daemonum was among the top 10 most important books ever published in the history of humanity. Now, I don't think I'd go that far, but this is a pretty landmark moment in the history of the development of how our mind might affect our body. Thus, this melancholic condition, especially among poor women and unlearned women, faced with theologically sophisticated inquisitors bent on confessions and having access to torture as a means of getting them, according to Weyer, largely created the very monstrous heresy they were attempting to eradicate. However, to the demonologists of the time, including King James I of England, Weyer's denial of diabolism was evidence of his own diabolism, and Weyer was mercilessly attacked by witch hunters like James I and Jean Bodin. Now, to be clear, Weyer still very much believed in demons, but in the more typically Protestant, yeah, they're real out there, but if you were a really good Christian, you don't have to really worry about them kind of way. Unlike what he took to be Catholic superstitions that actually inspired demonic-inspired delusions. He thinks all the superstitious rituals of Catholicism are basically just tantamount to necromancy. Further, I'm also sure that he held that people, including women, did in fact make pacts with the devil under such deluded agendas. But people for him needed spiritual education and repentance and the simple faith in Christ and not torture, confession, and execution. Now, I've made a whole episode going through De Prestigiis by Johannes Weyer, including his attempt to actually mock those who summon demons, but then he actually ended up being the foundation for modern demonic magic. So that's ironic, but if you're interested in learning more about Johannes Weyer, you can check out the episode that I've made about him. But following on the logic developed by Weyer and responding to the jurist and demonologist Jean Bodin, whose 1580 The Demon Mania of the Sorcerers was in many ways the true successor to the Malleus Maleficarum, the Englishman Reginald Scott would publish his monumental The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584. And this absolutely wonderful text, if you can ever get a facsimile of it, or a real one, although they cost about 30 grand, it is just amazing. It's full of lurid woodcuts meant to expose the ridiculous nature of witchcraft beliefs of mostly inquisitors that held them. It deepens the analysis begun by Weyer, and Scott takes a fourfold critique of the trials. First, he takes a sociological analysis revealing how poverty, begging, and social ostracization of marginalized women, in fact, makes them the target of blame for all of community woes. Cow dies? Poor woman. Crops fail? Poor woman. So when something bad, you blame the poor begging lady, because clearly she's the devil. Further, he contrasts the sorcerers of the Bible to those of the demonologists, and he finds them basically incongruent. The Bible seems to be describing some group of people, the demonologist something else, and you can't justify persecuting the one on the basis of the other. In fact, he actually says that all of the powers attributed to these witches are just heretically salacious. And then he has a point-by-point takedown of the criminal elements of witchcraft enumerated by Jean Bodin, revealing them to be vacuous, legally redundant, or just both. And this section of the book, however, is just downright hilarious. Bodin's like, "But witches poison people." And Scott's like, "Yeah, but that's just murder, isn't it? I mean, let them be hanged for their labor," Scott has. Lastly, Scott also brings to bear a litany of philosophical and proto-scientific arguments to detail just how the claims made by Jean Bodin and other demonologists about the marvelous feats of witches are just impossible. They just can't do all the things that the witches are said to be able to do, and believing that they do, by the way, is heretical. Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft is a classic for good reasons, and I'm going to do a whole episode about it, frankly, because it's just that amazing. And it combines great philosophical, theological, and scientific argumentation with a heaping dose of English sardonic wit. So well worth coming back to that, and well worth taking a look at it if you ever get the chance. But about a year later, Michel, what in the hell do I know, de Montaigne, would also weigh in on the trials around 1585. Traveling through Germany, he had occasion to read several confessions and interview about a dozen alleged witches who were then on trial. And while he confessed that witchcraft might be real, he was much more convinced that people would lie to themselves or others than simply accepting that these marvelous tales, such as the infamous flight to the witches' Sabbath, were true. Further, after contemplating his interaction with these alleged witches, he suggested that they should be given the herb hellebore, one for treating insanity, rather than hemlock, one for execution, thus expressing his classic witty skepticism of the whole murderous business of the witch trials. Francis Bacon, for his part, generally accepted as the founder of the scientific method in his Novum Organum, takes a somewhat nuanced view to witches and witchcraft more generally. He notes that the tales told by witches or confessed by witches and of witches should be subject to resolution through solid evidence. If they say they can fly, I need to see you fly. Thus, that belief of a marvel under confession, especially under torture, for instance of flight to the Sabbath, should be held under strict evidence. Something like bigger claims require bigger evidence. But wholesale skepticism wasn't warranted for him either. For instance, he states that such flights are said to be the result of using something like a magical flying ointment. And indeed, he recounts the ingredients of such an ointment and actually agrees that it can produce an experience very much like a delirium of the feeling of flight. In fact, he even goes on to suggest a better recipe for inducing just such a delirium. In some sense, hilariously, Francis Bacon basically decides To outwitch the witches? With his own custom Francis Bacon brand flying ointment. Who knew that the founder of empiricism was also a proto-redditor? But in the final analysis, Bacon takes witchcraft as a more epistemological rather than moral or theological sin. He thinks of it as basically worshipping false gods, knowing them to be false and wicked. And in that sense, he supports legal correction through imprisonment and pillory, though he doesn't seem to suggest capital punishment to fit this crime. So Bacon has a kind of both and position when it comes to the nature and reality of witchcraft. Also, you should never attempt to create his flying ointment. I have a whole video on flying ointments if you want to check it out. The Basque witch trials, which happened between 1609 and 1614, were the most extensive in Spanish history, mostly due to a sort of outbreak of this because of children's confessions of being taken to the witches' sabbat. Now, alarmed at the outbreak of diabolism, the Spanish Inquisition, yeah, we do in fact expect them here at Esoterica. I mean, just, it's John D right there. Yes, at any rate, they sent a young canon lawyer named Alonso de Salazar Frias with an edict of grace, which allowed for confession of witchcraft without the threat of punishment. The people that trusted that were real brave. To investigate on basically what in the devil was going on in Euskadi, over there in the Basque country. Operating in the fashion of a true detective, starring Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, Salazar meticulously analyzed in each and every confession. He would ultimately make 9 detailed reports to his superiors between 1612 and 1623. In the second report of 1612, he announced a startling conclusion to the folks over there in Madrid. None of these confessions had any basis in reality. They were contradictory, they were impossible, they were born out of children's imaginations, they were delusions and panic confessions to avoid torture and burning at the stake, which did happen. And to be clear, never once does Salazar deny the reality of the devil or witches or witchcraft. His conclusions is just that a sober analysis of the evidence arrived at by interrogation under grace rather than under torture, revealed that the panic was a web of nonsense. His final analysis and recommendations of 1623 basically mark the end of the witch hunting by the Spanish Inquisition. So, good job, Salazar. Of course, the torture and murder of conversos and indigenous people in the New World was still moving right along at pace. Now, I'm going to come back to do an episode on the Basque witch trials, which are just very well documented and very, very, very interesting. And we're going to look more at Salazar's analysis in a future episode, but I just wanted to include him among the philosophers for doing the one thing that makes any philosopher worth their salt. Critical thinking. He did that. He did the critical thinking. He had every reason to simply follow the crowd, repeat the standard witch narratives, and follow orders, but he followed the evidence, or lack thereof, and he employed reason and logic to evaluate what was actually happening and actually going on. In doing so, this inquisitor saved untold lives. His influence, thank goodness, would eventually reach the Roman Inquisition, and in many ways, his methods and recommendations would prove to be the very beginning of the end of the Catholic witch trials, at least in Europe. Your mileage would definitely vary in Central and South America. Not long after the Basque trials, René Descartes' Discourse on Method would appear in 1637, followed by his famous Meditations in 1641, signaling the rationalist revolution. And while the new philosophy would have implications for virtually every major theological question, including the existence and nature of God, the nature of spirits, demonic possession, the effectiveness of magic, and the power of witches, among basically many others, Descartes himself never waded into such waters in publication. He never tells his opinions about what was going on vis-a-vis witches and witchcraft. In fact, he was pretty prudent and careful to not even publish his rather materialist treatise called The World during his lifetime following the verdict that he saw was passed on Galileo, not to mention what the Roman Inquisition did to Giordano Bruno. In fact, the entire book wouldn't even appear until well after 25 years when Descartes was safely dead. But the new philosophy was, and is to this day, controversial for arguing for the existence of two distinct substances, a extended substance of body and a non-extended substance of mental stuff. The Meditations, and especially in the Objections and Replies, and then more clearly in the Principles, also basically introduced a third substance, the divine substance, marked by necessary existence, but we'll leave that to Baruch Spinoza in just a minute. Now, the thorniest problem of the new philosophy was the interaction of that mental substance with a physical substance, suggested by Descartes to occur somewhere in the human being up in our pineal gland. But mental substances as self-conscious thought we surely only encounter in ourselves. But given the goodness of God, we can't avoid the nightmare of solipsism because basically God wouldn't allow us to be fooled that there are other people thinking stuff. However, Descartes did ultimately relegate magic and even angels to the realm of the imagination, and then demoted the imagination from a medieval organ of perception to simply a factory of made-up fake images. However, in the conversation with Berman, which is really one of the earliest interviews of this period, toward the end of his life, he does speculate, while he doesn't know anything about angels, that if they existed, he speculates, as embodied beings, their minds would have clear and distinct knowledge of those bodies, unlike ours. We don't have clear and distinct knowledge of what's going on inside my heart or something. But suffice to say that Descartes generally avoids any just outright denials of things like angels, spirits, demons, and witchcraft, and aside from a few passing references, even magic. But his system, at least by implication, leaves no room for witches, magic, demonic possession, and thus the prosecution of witchcraft is simply murder heaped upon superstition for the new philosophy. And we'll see in a bit that that combination of Cartesian philosophy with biblical criticism is going to lead the radical Dutch minister Balthasar Bekker in a categorical attack on diabolism, demonic possession, the concept of witchcraft, and even the idea that Satan himself is anything other than just a symbol for evil, and thus isn't to be making deals with witches at all. Now we jump across the channel again to Thomas Hobbes, famous for his theory of the need of a political sovereign in which is invested all political might so as to avoid descending into a state of nature as perpetual war, and he has a few things interesting to say about witchcraft. For his part, Hobbes was a mechanistic materialist, and thus angels, demons, and spirits are simply born out of confusing mental images or dreams or visions as real entities in the world. In fact, he blames the Gentiles, that is to say the ancient pagans, for making just such a confusion and then passing along to the Jews, with the exceptions of the Sadducees. That's the ancient Jewish sect that rejected the idea of angels and afterlife. And thus, they made that mistake, and it was ultimately injected into Christianity. That is to say, thinking that they were spirits outside of the mind. Though oddly enough, he also says that all the angels of the Old Testament were just visions, whereas the ones in the New Testament were physically real entities. So he's not terribly consistent on this issue. But the existence of demons is just rejected as a phantasms of the brain, as he has it, along with fairies and ghosts, and thus witches are deprived of any such beings to make pacts with. Indeed, Hobbes lambasts the Catholic Church as promoting such superstitions in rituals, in scriptural interpretation, and in religious practice so as to enslave the population within a kingdom of darkness. He loves to use the language of demonology and kingdom of darkness, but it's just really metaphor. And yet, despite his naturalism as regards demons, Hobbes suggests something shocking when it comes to witchcraft. As he writes in Leviathan, "As for witches, I think not that their witchcraft is any real power, but yet they are justly punished for the false belief they have that they can do much mischief, joined with their purpose to it if they can, their trade being nearer to a new religion than to a craft or a science." He doesn't believe in witchcraft at all, and yet those that pretend to do it make mischief and thus disrupt the social order presumably and should be punished just the same. At first, it's a jarring juridical idea, but given the centrality of social order under sovereign power for Hobbes, it's not at all surprising. For Hobbes, a purified Christianity devoid of all this pagan superstition and philosophy must be brought under secular sovereign control to ensure avoiding that descent into the terrible state of nature, wherein life is, say it with me now, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. John Locke, for his part, seems to have said basically nothing on the topic of spirits, angels or demons, or much less witches and witchcraft. Again, this is pretty shocking considering what's going on in England at that time. But Locke, for his part in the essay, says that human beings were simply under an absolute ignorance when it comes to such matters as the existence, nature, and rank of beings between us and the divine. We just don't know anything about them and can't. This, however, is rather a feature rather than being a bug in the system for Locke, because it leaves, quote, nothing left on which to build the superstitions that had so long afflicted humanity. Of course, that might have included for Locke swimming and burning so-called witches, which was going on in England, but Locke, he never says as much. Spinoza, pantheist, atheist, or somehow mystically both, also provides very little room for the reality of angels, demons, ghosts, or witchcraft in his system. For him, there is just one substance, God, of which there are infinite attributes. Human beings, us, as modes of the divine nature substance, have access to just two of those attributes, extension and thought. But as he points out in letters 56, 58, and 60, this leaves no room for entities between human beings and God. Thus, Spinoza radically banishes not only ghosts, but also angels and demons, including Satan, from his system. In fact, he says, I don't even know how to define what a ghost is outside of contradictory nonsense. Further, he suspects that Jesus himself was only talking to people in language that they could understand, rather than positing the existence of such beings when he invokes the reality of demons in some of his sermons. Spinoza even goes as far as to argue that on purely logical grounds, that the devil does not exist, but could not exist. On this line of reasoning, beings only persist in being insofar as they are part of the divine perfection and love that perfection. The devil, neither enjoying that perfection and actively rejecting that love in hatred of God, would always just fail to exist as such. Indeed, Spinoza even mocks the commonplace Christian idea of the time that, quote, divine justice permits the devil to deceive men with impunity, but does not permit men, haplessly perceived by and ensnared by the devil, to go unpunished, as simply morally vicious as it is metaphysically nonsensical. Nicolas Malebranche, one of the many clerical Cartesian rationalists, I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but many of the early adopters of the new philosophy were in fact clergy, is perhaps best known for his commitment to the position of occasionalism, the position that God alone is responsible for all efficient causation, and thus all causal interactions between extended things were merely apparent. They were simply occasions for God to cause them to interact, but nothing's actually interacting at all. God's basically doing all of this all the time. It's actually a position pretty common in Islamic mysticism, especially in people like Al-Ghazali, but it makes an important appearance here in Malebranche and kind of got him in trouble with the church a little bit. Regardless, I suspect that he goes understudied and underappreciated because he's too much of a rationalist for the Christians, and he's too Christian for the rationalists, given again his attempt to synthesize the philosophies of Augustine and the philosophy of Descartes, which on the face of it does seem like a kind of crazy thing to do. Regardless of that, Malebranche held that true witchcraft, authentic satanic pacts, were indeed real, but very rare. And he never does deny the reality of the devil. Indeed, God may make satanic efficiency apparent for reasons known only to the divine, perhaps for the edification of the faithful. Remember, the devil can't do anything on Malebranche's system. God makes the devil appear to be doing things. However, most so-called witchcraft is actually a kind of mass delusion caused by what we would now call psychological priming. That is to say, if one is raised and taught that witchcraft is real and operative in the world, then one will see the activity of witchcraft everywhere something bad happens. Again, cows die, witchcraft. Child dies, witchcraft. And this inspires some people to actually seek out diabolical powers out of a kind of social desperation or want of any real agency in society. You want to be able to do things like that. True witches, then, are able to seek out and acquire satanic powers in order to do evil, and in that evil, they should, according to him, be put to death. If you're trying to do evil through witchcraft, well, you get what's coming to you. But what he calls imaginary witches are basically people LARPing as witches, even going so far as to use flying ointments and charms and trickery to inflate their own sense of power and agency, but without any real desire to make a pact with the devil and do the world any evil. They're just acting out, basically. These imaginary witches, he claims, are growing all the time, mostly as a result of the very trials meant to eliminate them, and thus should be subjected to correction and punishment, but not murder and torture. Now, this analysis is, I think, rather ingenious to my mind, and actually mirrors how the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 90s actually did create a subculture of what is now known in the anthropological literature as pseudo-Satanists. Those people actually had aped what the witch hunters were saying was real out in metal shows and Dungeons and Dragons. At any rate, Malebranche, while rejecting the flight to the Sabbath as a dream, does suggest the reality of diabolical witchcraft, but notes that, quote, the courts that throw out the indictments of witchcraft as most equitable. Thus, we get what we should expect from Malebranche, a rationalist priest holding to the theological past with one hand and to the judicial future with another, with something like psychology as a bridge. Leibniz, himself influenced by Kabbalah and co-inventor of the calculus, so you can blame him for that, also says virtually nothing on the topic of witches and witchcraft, though he seems rather orthodox on religious topics, but he also had a penchant for just making sure he was on the up and up, at least in terms of appearances for the sake of court and propriety, more than basically anything else. You can just ask about his revisionist memory of his interactions with Spinoza for more on that. Leibniz, you did Spinoza dirty, and I'll never forgive you for it. However, in his Theodicy, he does praise an early patron of his, Father Spee, the Archbishop-Elector of Mainz, for his publication of a book called Cautio Criminalis, which argued for the ceasing of the burning of alleged sorcerers after he, Father Spee, actually escorted several people to the pyre that he knew to be innocent. This would, in turn, inspire the Bishop of Würzburg and also the Archbishop of Mainz, who, as soon as they came to power, to put an end to these burnings, as Leibniz approvingly describes at Theodicy section 97. Thus, while it's not at all clear if Leibniz rejected the reality of witchcraft and pacts with the devil, given his peculiar belief of all these infinite monads reflecting each other, he certainly seems to have wanted to see an end to the executions, and the end of those executions he clearly approved of and thought of as social progress. Joseph Glanville's Sadducismus Triumphatus, which is just an amazing title, Sadducism Triumphant, published in 1681, was one of the final salvos in the defense of the elaborated theory of witchcraft, and it directly inspired the outbreak of the witch hysteria in Salem. However, even in this text, the tide was turning in the direction of material mechanism, whereby Glanville held that the witches and Satan still had operative force through the forces of nature as God had made them, and that those forces of nature were basically mechanical in nature. But given the marvelous nature of these productions, they simply couldn't be caused by any natural human doing, and were thus supernatural in nature. They were basically evil miracles of a certain kind. Glanville himself was a member of the Royal Society, and natural mechanism, inspired by Descartes, was at that time all the rage. And yet, the empirical reality of these super marvels led people like Glanville to defend instances of supernatural causation, and in turn, the reality of witchcraft. Yeah, it's a rather strange outcome, a kind of horseshoe effect. Indeed, Glanville denoted anyone who rejected such instances of witchcraft, and even as hauntings, as modern-day Sadducees, akin to, again, that ancient Jewish philosophy that rejected the existence of angels and demons, along with the existence of the afterlife. But John Webster's The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft of 1677 led a full attack on the arguments of Glanville, which eventually appeared after his death, after Glanville's death, again in Septuagintus Triumphatus. He breaks with Glanville's theory of natural mechanism, or supernatural mechanism, and suggests that rather than demonic intervention, which upsets natural law, being the culprit of witchcraft and hauntings, that very natural, though occult forces pervade reality, and manipulation of those occult forces are responsible for the marvels associated with witchcraft, magic, demonology, hauntings, etc. Thus, pacts with the devil provide no special boon at all. In fact, they provide nothing at all. They're illusory, and thus Webster dismisses the reality of witchcraft as such, but rather as the result of often incidental manipulation, or the manipulation of those occult forces for reasons that they don't fully understand. Thus, the witch is operative, but not for the reasons that they think they are, or for the reasons that witch hunters think they are. Again, this is a surprising, even shocking reversal. Webster is skeptical of the reality of witchcraft along precisely hermetic and occult lines, like those of the occult philosophy of a Cornelius Agrippa, discussed all the way back at the beginning of this episode. Thus, we have a truly bizarre outcome. Near the end of the 18th century, we find mechanical naturalists defending the existence of the traditional witch belief, and hermetic Neoplatonic devotees of occult philosophy skeptical of the reality of such witches and their power. Of course, Webster may have another motive at work here as well. He was a doctor who employed Paracelsian and other occult means, like the weapon salve, as a means of healing people, and I suspect he just didn't want any of his medical practice associated with witchcraft. Thus, I suspect he sought to distance his own hermetic medicine from the alleged wiles of diabolical witchery. Finally, I just want to introduce in a very cursory way the important work of Balthasar Bekker. In fact, I just want to do a whole episode on him in the future, so let this be a placeholder for it. His 1695 book, The World Bewitched, translated eventually into German, French, and English, of which he signed copies, by the way, which is relatively unusual in the early modern period, was among the final and most decisive blows against the elaborated theory of witchcraft. In fact, this episode is somewhat bookended by two Dutchmen, Johann Weyer and Bekker, who took Weyer's analysis to its, I think, logical conclusion, arguing against virtually every aspect of the elaborated theory of witchcraft over several hundred densely packed pages. Indeed, Bekker reduced the devil to nothing more than a symbol of evil, robbing Satan of any substantial reality, much less the ability to make pacts with so-called witches. Relying on his very Calvinist theology and his Cartesian philosophy, Bekker magnified the power of God such that the devil was reduced to mere symbolism. Combining scriptural analysis, the emerging scientific worldview, and the new Cartesian philosophy, Bekker just systematically demolishes the major positions held in the elaborated theory of witchcraft, and moreover, he was wanting to put witch hunting to an end once and for all. And he argues that those making accusations of witchcraft, they should be the ones being punished. And for his trouble, he was, of course you could imagine what's about to happen, for his trouble he was subject effectively to excommunication, which is not the worst thing, all things told, and put on trial for a range of crimes against the church and state. He was ultimately acquitted, thank goodness, and he was able to maintain his state pay from the city of Amsterdam, and his book became one of the final nails in the coffin of the witch trials. But of course, trials and even executions would continue up into the 18th century, as late as the 1770s, but became rarer and increasingly subject to ecclesiastical, juridical, and public outcry. Bekker, in some sense, marks the end of any real intellectual defense of witches, witchcraft, and diabolism. Philosophical modernity was born right alongside the early modern witch hunts. And as we've seen, nearly all of these philosophers were privately skeptical of the reality of witchcraft, and even of the reality of Satan and the demons, and therefore of the necessity of these trials. But with only a few exceptions, few had the moral and intellectual courage to publicly rail against a nightmarish injustice they experienced all around them. But of course, it's easy to moralize from a historical distance, and yet, my having survived a satanic panic myself and living in the early days of a new one, right now, there are lessons here for those that care at all about not reliving the horrors of the past. In this episode, frankly, like all my episodes on the history and development of the elaborated theory of witchcraft, the institution of the Inquisition, and the frenzy of the early modern witch trials, they're all made in the service of learning from that past. And as evidenced in this episode, philosophers and intellectuals are not in the least exempt from learning those lessons. Of course, more on the demonologists, on witchcraft, on the intellectual and philosophical and spiritual esoteric currents that created the very modernity that we all dwell in, for better and for worse. I've included some links in the description if you want to learn more about these topics and witchcraft and the Inquisition. But until soon, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.